So we now know that the brain changes all through your life, depending on the nature of your thoughts. And certain sustained thoughts will produce measurable physical differences and change the structure of the brain. We also know now that thoughts actually form your brain and not the other way around. So thinking certain thoughts helps us become a more powerful receiver. But is it also possible to develop a larger transmitter? To find this out, I had to study masters of intention who were particularly gifted at transmitting. I interviewed many healers, Qigong masters, Buddhist monks, other kinds of masters of intention. And from that, I wanted to find out what practices they had in common in order to distill this into a simple program that all of us could use. The first thing I found that was common to all these masters of intention is that they stepped out of the self of separation. They worked hard on entering an altered state of consciousness. They needed in some way to achieve peak attention. Now, individually, they did this in a number of different ways. Some used prayer, some focused their attention on the healee, some used symbolic ideas or mental images of healing. Others tried verbal affirmations or mental imagery or some sort of internal auto-suggestion or even something like a chant. But they found once they got to that point of union that their perception markedly altered and their motor skills began to diminish. They felt an expanded sense of pure present and began to grow unaware of the passage of time. Many said they lost awareness of the boundaries of their own bodies and they would experience an altered sense of bodily image. Some other ones felt they were actually out of their physical being. They'd begin to experience themselves kind of as a core that remains, they would describe it as, but they would feel engulfed by a sense of unconditional love. As part of this process, they found it was important to turn off the ego and eliminate their sense of self. They would do this by visualizing themselves as uniting with the person to be healed, or imagine themselves and that person as being united with what they described as the absolute and I describe as the field. Some of them would try to assume the body and the vantage point of the person they were trying to heal. And they would begin to feel the healee's body changing with certain shifts of patterns and distributions of energy. Ultimately, they felt like they were an observer, standing and watching this process, while something else took over. I was also interested in trying to find out who would likely be the best intenders. And I found, although all of us can become a good intender, the best are those with so-called thin boundaries. This is a psychological term that was created by a psychiatrist called Ernest Hartman, who created an actual test to test a person's psychological armament. People with thick boundaries are well-organized type of people, dependable, defensive, and Hartman himself liked to call them well-armored. They are the kind of people that have a sturdy sense of self that remains locked around them, almost like a fence. People with thin boundaries, on the other hand, tend to be open, unguarded, undefended. These are the sensitive and vulnerable type people, creative people, people who tend to get involved quickly in relationships or who experience altered states, or those kinds of people who easily flip between fantasy and reality. If this describes you, you'll find it easier than most to step out of the self and to turn off the ego. Getting out of the way, moving aside, is another crucial aspect of intention. The late psychiatrist Elizabeth Targ carried out a very famous AIDS study where she recruited 40 healers of every persuasion and asked them to send intention to patients with terminal AIDS. Those healers were very successful, And when she broke down and analyzed the healers with the greatest success, she found there were two kinds of healers. One type described themselves as the water, the source of healing. The other described themselves as the hose, the channel for healing energy to travel through. By far the most successful group were the channelers, those who felt they were just a vehicle for a greater force beyond themselves. Now, these healers were healers of every persuasion, everything from traditional Christian healers to Qigong masters to Native American shaman. But no matter what their approach, the most successful agreed on a single point, the need to get out of the way. They felt they were surrendering to their healing force. They would frame their intention more or less as a request. Please, may this person be healed. And then they would step back. As I say, the healers who were most successful were the channelers, the ones who had moved aside to allow the greater force in. No healer who'd been successful believed he possessed the power himself. Harry Edwards is one of the most remarkable and best studied of healers. He once wrote, "A healer works by handing over his will and his request for healing to a greater power." So the most important act of all, according to Edwards, is moving aside, making a conscious attempt to get out of the way. All of the healers I interviewed have described their experience as a sense of total surrender to a higher being or even to the process. And all believe they're part of a greater whole. To gain access to this cosmic true consciousness, what I call the field, they had to set aside the limiting boundaries of the self and personal identity and merge with this larger entity. With this change of consciousness and expanded awareness, all the healers felt they'd suddenly got onto an open line to a larger information field, which offered them flashes of information, symbols, and images. They'd suddenly gained access to this information. At that moment, they'd entered the field.